Most nights in the quiet suburbs outside Seattle, when the rain tapped softly against the windows and the streetlights painted long shadows across the yard, Claire would hear a faint sound drifting up from the basement, a fragile melody that didn't quite know how to stand on its own yet, and at first she told herself it was just the house settling or an old pipe humming, but deep down she knew it was something else, something human, something lonely. She would pause at the top of the stairs, holding her breath, listening to the uneven notes of the old upright piano that had once belonged to her late husband, Mark, and each note felt like a question hanging in the air, and the one playing it was Daniel, her 14-year-old stepson, a boy who had grown taller over the past year but somehow quieter, smaller in spirit, as if grief had wrapped around him and refused to let go. Since Mark's passing 2 years ago, Daniel had learned how to move through the house without making noise, how to answer questions with one word, how to smile politely without letting anyone see the storm behind his eyes, and Claire had tried everything she knew to reach him: home-cooked dinners, movie nights, gentle talks in the kitchen, but every effort felt like knocking on a locked door, and she feared she would always stand on the outside of his world. That night, though, the music pulled her closer than ever before, and instead of turning back like she usually did, she slowly walked down the carpeted steps, careful not to let them creak, her heart pounding harder with every note she heard. And when she reached the bottom, she saw him sitting alone on the piano bench under the dim yellow bulb, his back slightly curved, his dark hair falling into his eyes as his fingers pressed the keys with careful determination, as if he were trying to rebuild something broken one sound at a time. There were sheet papers scattered around him, some crumpled, some neatly stacked, and she realized he had been teaching himself in secret, probably watching online videos late at night, practicing when he thought no one was paying attention, holding on to the only piece of his father that still felt alive. The piano had once filled the house with laughter when Mark played old love songs on Sunday mornings, and now it carried a different kind of emotion, softer but deeper, and Claire felt a tight ache in her chest as she watched Daniel pause, close his eyes, and start again after missing a note. Refusing to give up, even though no one was there to clap for him, no one was there to guide him. She understood in that instant that this wasn't just about music, it was about memory, about a boy who didn't know how to talk about his pain but had found a way to pour it into something gentle and beautiful. She stepped back into the shadows when he suddenly looked over his shoulder, afraid of breaking the moment, and she saw how tired he looked, how much he was carrying without saying a word. And guilt washed over her because she had been so focused on not pushing him that she had missed the signs of how alone he felt. Upstairs, the house looked normal: clean kitchen counters, framed photos on the wall, the soft hum of the heater. But down here was the truth: a teenager trying to hold his world together with trembling hands. Daniel started playing a simple melody again, slower this time, and Claire recognized it as one of the songs Mark used to hum, and the sound nearly brought her to her knees, because it was imperfect yet full of love, and she suddenly saw not her stepson but a child who missed his father more than he knew how to express. In that quiet basement, time felt suspended, and Claire made a silent promise to herself that she would not let him carry this by himself anymore, that she would find a way to step into his world without forcing her way in, that she would protect the small spark he was nurturing. When the last note faded, Daniel sat still for a moment, staring at the keys as if waiting for them to answer back. Then he gently closed the piano lid and turned off the light, walking past her on the stairs without realizing she had been there, and she watched him disappear into his room, the door clicking shut with a soft final sound. Claire remained in the basement alone, running her fingers lightly over the piano keys, feeling the cool surface, understanding that something important had just been revealed to her, something fragile and sacred, and as she stood there in the quiet she knew that this was the moment everything would begin to change. Because now she had seen the truth: her stepson was fighting his sadness in the only way he knew how, alone in the dark, and she could no longer pretend she didn't hear the music. The morning after Claire heard Daniel playing in the basement, she acted normal, but inside her mind was racing with quiet plans, and as the pale sunlight slipped through the kitchen curtains in their small Oregon town, she flipped pancakes on the stove, remembering how Mark used to joke that Saturday mornings were for music and maple syrup. And when Daniel walked in, tall and sleepy, rubbing his eyes and moving carefully like he didn't want to disturb the air, Claire watched him closely without making it obvious, noticing the faint shadows under his eyes that told her he had been up late again. She placed a plate in front of him and asked gently about school, about friends, about anything that might open a door, but he answered with short words, polite but distant, and she realized that pushing him about the piano would only make him retreat deeper into silence, so she decided on a different approach, one built on patience rather than pressure. After he left to meet a friend, Claire picked up her phone and stepped onto the porch where the air felt cool and fresh, and she searched for someone who could help Daniel without making him feel exposed, someone kind, someone experienced, someone who understood that music could carry grief without turning it into a performance. And after a few calls she found Mrs. Eleanor Langford, a retired music teacher who had spent decades teaching high school students how to find confidence through melody, and when Claire explained the situation in careful words, Mrs. Langford listened quietly before saying, "Sometimes the right guidance feels less like teaching and more like standing beside someone," and Claire knew instantly she had found the right person. They arranged for a casual visit, nothing formal, just an introduction, and over the next few days Claire prepared the basement, cleaning the dust from the piano, placing a small lamp beside it, organizing the scattered papers Daniel had left behind without changing their order too much because she didn't want him to feel invaded. And every time she heard him practicing at night she smiled softly but stayed upstairs, allowing him to keep his safe space while she quietly built a bridge toward him. Saturday arrived faster than she expected, and when the doorbell rang Daniel looked confused because they rarely had visitors, and when Mrs. Langford stepped inside with warm eyes and a gentle smile, Daniel froze slightly, his guard rising in an instant, and Claire could see the fear flicker across his face, the silent question of why someone was here. Why his private world had suddenly been noticed, but before he could retreat, Claire spoke calmly, telling him that Mrs. Langford had once taught many students who felt nervous about sharing their music, that she wasn't here to judge but simply to listen. Daniel hesitated, his shoulders tense, but something about Mrs. Langford's quiet presence seemed to ease the sharp edges of his fear, and when she asked if he would show her what he had been working on, her voice carried no pressure, only invitation. Slowly, he walked down to the basement, Claire following at a respectful distance, her heart pounding as if she were the one about to perform, and when Daniel sat at the piano bench his hands trembled slightly. Yet he began to play, the melody soft and uncertain at first, but steady enough to show how much effort he had poured into it over months of secret practice. Mrs. Langford didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't sigh at mistakes, she simply listened with full attention, nodding gently. And when he finished she offered small suggestions wrapped in encouragement, pointing out the strength in his timing, the emotion in his touch, the promise in his natural rhythm, and Daniel's eyes shifted from guarded to curious, as if he was realizing that someone else could see the beauty in what he had been building alone. Claire stood near the stairs, watching the scene unfold like a sunrise after a long winter, and for the first time since Mark's passing she saw Daniel engaged with someone, not hiding, not shrinking, but present. The lesson lasted an hour, yet it felt like the turning of a page, and when Mrs. Langford left, she made sure to tell Daniel she looked forward to hearing him again next week, planting the idea that this was not a one-time event but the beginning of something steady. Later that evening, Daniel lingered upstairs instead of disappearing into the basement immediately, and though he didn't say much, there was a softness in his movements, a subtle shift in how he sat at the dinner table, and Claire understood that trust is not built with grand gestures but with quiet consistency. Over the following weeks, the house slowly changed as music filled the air more often during daylight instead of darkness, and Daniel began practicing with purpose, sometimes even asking small questions about tempo or chords, and Claire answered when she could, careful not to pretend she knew more than she did. She noticed he no longer flinched when she passed by the basement door, and once she even heard him replaying a correction Mrs. Langford had given him, determined to get it right, not out of fear but out of desire to grow. Claire realized that what she had done was simple on the surface, she had arranged a teacher, but beneath that action was something deeper. She had stepped into his loneliness without accusing him of it, had offered support without forcing gratitude, and in doing so she had shown him that caring did not mean controlling. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the living room in gold light, Daniel came upstairs after practicing and paused near the kitchen doorway, as if debating whether to speak, and then he quietly said, "She's nice," referring to Mrs. Langford, and Claire smiled, keeping her tone light as she replied, "I thought you might like her," and though the conversation was short, it carried more meaning than long talks ever had. In that small exchange, Claire felt the first true crack in the wall that had stood between them for years, and she understood that healing rarely arrives in dramatic moments, it comes in steady steps, in Saturday mornings filled with patient guidance, in melodies that grow stronger with practice. And as she listened to Daniel play again that night, not hidden but confident enough to let the sound travel upstairs. She knew the quiet plan she had set into motion was working, and for the first time since losing Mark, the house no longer felt heavy with silence but alive with hope. By early spring, the house no longer felt like a place holding its breath, because every Saturday morning music rose from the basement with new strength, and Daniel no longer played like someone hiding from the world but like someone slowly stepping into it, his fingers moving with more confidence across the old piano that once belonged to his father. And Claire noticed the change in small ways first, like how he started coming upstairs after lessons instead of locking himself away, how he would pour himself a glass of orange juice and actually sit at the kitchen island instead of taking it back to his room, how his shoulders didn't look as heavy as before. Mrs. Langford's visits had become a steady rhythm in their lives, and with each session Daniel learned not only chords and timing but courage, and Claire watched from a respectful distance, never hovering, never demanding updates, yet always listening, always present. And one quiet Tuesday evening she heard something different drifting up the stairs, not a song his father used to play, not an exercise from a lesson, but something new, something original, and curiosity drew her down again. Though this time she didn't hide in the shadows. She paused at the bottom step and saw Daniel bent over a notebook beside the piano, scribbling notes, crossing them out, then trying a few keys, stopping, adjusting, trying again. And there was frustration in his movements but also determination, and when he finally noticed her he didn't flinch or shut the piano lid like he once would have, he simply looked at her, uncertain but not closed off. "It's just something I'm working on," he said, almost apologizing for taking up space with his creativity, and Claire shook her head gently and told him she would love to hear it if he felt ready, and for a moment he studied her face as if searching for judgment. Finding none, he nodded slowly and began to play. The melody started soft, almost fragile, but then it rose into something fuller, richer, carrying layers of emotion that didn't need words, and Claire felt her throat tighten because she could hear the journey inside it, the sadness of loss woven together with the quiet hope of moving forward. And when he finished he kept his eyes on the keys, waiting, and the silence that followed felt deep but warm. "Your dad would have been proud," she said carefully, and Daniel swallowed hard before replying, "I know." And then after a small pause he added, "I wrote it for him, and for you." And the simple honesty of that confession changed something between them in an instant, because for the first time he was not just accepting her presence but including her in his story. From that evening on, the space between them grew smaller in ways that didn't need grand speeches. They started sharing simple routines, cooking dinner together, laughing quietly when the smoke alarm went off because they forgot the timer, watching old movies on the couch without the heavy silence that used to sit between them, and sometimes Daniel would ask about stories from when Claire first met his father, listening with real interest, not just polite curiosity. One night as rain tapped gently against the windows and the living room lights cast a soft glow, Daniel lingered by the kitchen sink while Claire washed dishes, and the air felt calm but thoughtful. And he finally asked the question that had been resting behind his eyes for months, "Why do you try so hard with me?" And there was no anger in his voice, only confusion, only the honest wonder of a teenager who had lost one parent and feared losing another connection. Claire dried her hands and turned to face him fully, not rushing her answer, and told him in steady words that loving his father had never been separate from loving him, that family was not only about blood but about choice. About showing up even when things felt uncomfortable, about staying when it might be easier to step back. And Daniel listened without interrupting, absorbing every word. He didn't respond right away, but his expression softened, and in that quiet exchange Claire realized that trust is built not in dramatic moments but in repeated acts of care, in being consistent, in letting someone know you are not going anywhere. As weeks passed, Daniel began practicing with the basement door open, allowing the music to travel through the house freely, and sometimes he would call up the stairs, "Does this part sound okay?" And Claire would smile because that question meant he valued her opinion, meant he no longer saw himself as completely alone in his passion. Mrs. Langford noticed the change too, commenting on how his playing carried more emotion, more clarity, and Daniel accepted praise now without shrinking from it. And one afternoon after a lesson he surprised Claire by asking if she would sit beside him while he tried a new section, and as they shared the piano bench, their shoulders barely touching, she felt the quiet weight of years beginning to lift. The grief for his father had not disappeared, it never would, but it no longer stood like a wall between them. It had become something they could speak about openly, something that connected rather than divided. Daniel started talking about school more, about a friend who liked photography, about a teacher who encouraged him to consider joining the music club, and Claire listened carefully, aware that these small conversations were signs of a larger healing, and every now and then she caught him smiling to himself while writing in his notebook, composing pieces that blended memory with hope. The house felt different now, filled with sound and light, and Claire understood that what had once been a fragile bridge between them was becoming a solid path built on shared moments, mutual respect, and gentle honesty, and though neither of them said it out loud, both could feel that their relationship was no longer defined by the word step. It was defined by presence, by choice, by the simple act of staying, and as Daniel's music grew stronger, so did the bond between them, steady and real, like a melody finally finding its rhythm. The night of the school talent show arrived with a cool breeze and a sky painted in soft shades of blue and gold, and Daniel stood backstage in the high school auditorium in Portland, Oregon, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, because even after months of lessons, practice, and quiet growth, stepping onto a stage felt different from playing in the safety of the basement, and Claire could see the fear flicker across his face though he tried to hide it behind a calm expression. Earlier that week she had found the crumpled permission slip in the trash and understood instantly that he wanted to try but was afraid to fail, so she simply placed it back on his desk with a pen beside it. No lecture, no pressure, just a silent message that she believed in him, and the next morning it had been signed, a small but brave decision that now led to this moment. The auditorium buzzed with parents, teachers, and students, the lights bright and warm, the stage curtains heavy and red, and Daniel's name was printed in simple black letters on the program, and as each performer before him finished, the sound of applause felt both encouraging and terrifying. Claire stood close enough to offer support but far enough to give him space, and when he whispered, "What if I mess up?" she gently replied, "Then you'll keep going," her voice steady, her eyes full of quiet pride. And when his name was finally called, time seemed to slow as he walked toward the stage alone, the spotlight catching his figure, the room growing still. He sat at the grand piano placed at center stage, adjusted the bench slightly, and for a split second his fingers hovered above the keys, hesitation visible, and Claire felt her heart race because she knew this pause held every doubt he had carried since losing his father, every fear of not being good enough, every memory of playing alone in the dark basement. But then he took a breath and pressed the first key. The melody began softly, almost fragile, but clear, and as he moved into the second phrase his hands steadied, the notes flowing with more confidence, and the audience leaned in, sensing something real in the sound, something honest. This was not just a performance, it was a story told without words, a journey from sadness to strength, from silence to expression, and Claire watched as the boy who once avoided eye contact now sat tall at the piano, his back straight, his focus sharp, his heart open. And she realized she was witnessing not only musical growth but personal courage unfolding in real time. The melody swelled, then softened, weaving through moments of quiet reflection before rising again with hopeful energy, and in those shifting dynamics Claire could hear echoes of his father's old songs blended with Daniel's own style, proof that he was not trapped in the past but building something new from it. A few small mistakes appeared, barely noticeable, but Daniel didn't stop, he didn't freeze. He kept moving forward just as she had encouraged him to do, and that resilience felt more powerful than perfect notes. When the final chord rang out, clear and strong, the room held its breath for a heartbeat before erupting into applause that filled every corner of the auditorium, and Daniel blinked in surprise as if he hadn't expected such a response, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Claire standing near the aisle, clapping with tears streaming down her face, and in that instant his expression changed from nervous to radiant, a smile spreading slowly, genuinely, the kind that comes from earned pride. He stood, bowed slightly, and walked off stage with a new kind of confidence in his step, and when he reached her she wrapped him in a firm but gentle hug, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady and real, and she whispered, "You did it." And he nodded, still catching his breath, still processing the applause, the lights, the realization that he had faced his fear and won. As they walked out into the cool night air, the parking lot glowing under street lamps, Daniel looked different, taller somehow, lighter, and after a few quiet steps he spoke in a voice that carried both gratitude and certainty. "Thanks for not letting me quit." And Claire smiled because she knew the credit belonged to him, but she also understood that sometimes people just need someone to believe in them when they cannot yet believe in themselves. He hesitated, then added softly, "I'm glad you're here. words simple but filled with meaning, and Claire felt her heart swell because those words meant acceptance, meant trust, meant that the bond they had built through patience and music had become something lasting. As they drove home, the radio playing low in the background, Daniel talked about possibly joining the school music club, about writing more songs, about maybe even performing again next year, dreams spoken aloud without fear, and Claire listened, knowing that the basement where he once played alone had been the starting point of this transformation. That night, before heading to bed, Daniel paused in the hallway and said quietly, "Good night, Mom," and the words settled gently between them, not forced, not dramatic, just natural, and Claire realized that what began with a simple decision to step into his loneliness had grown into a relationship built on choice, respect, and shared healing. And as she turned off the lights and the house fell into peaceful silence, she understood that the real miracle was not the applause in the auditorium but the courage that had taken root in her stepson's heart, a courage that would carry him far beyond that stage, and she felt grateful to have walked beside him every step of the way.